Good. So today's speaker is Sebastian Ko. Sebastian is assistant professor of philosophy at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. So a lot of his work focuses on meta-ethical and meta-normative questions, which is super good. But the main reason that we invited him today is his work on responsibility gaps. So he has several good papers on that as well. And today's talk is also on responsibility gaps. At least, sorry, I'm not so sure. So it's not completely focused on the responsibility gaps, but it's so the title is Responsible AI Through Conceptual Engineering. I suspect that we hear something, but I just give the mic to Sebastian and let him explain what he's going to do. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Herman, and thanks for the invitation. So I'm very happy to be able to present this. So this is still pretty much work in progress that I'm doing with Johannes Himmelreich from Syracuse, who's not going to be here today, but he's also looking forward to the feedback that we'll receive in this session. And yeah, so the title is Responsible AI Through Conceptual Engineering. And so let me start with the introduction. So autonomous weapon systems and self-driving cars, the prospects of those are increasingly realistic. And these kinds of technologies raise a lot of questions. And one of the questions they raise is, well, what happens? Who's responsible when someone is using a technology like this and the technology causes a harmful outcome? And the debate that is concerned with this question centers around this thing, this problem, the responsibility gap problem, which is the problem that it seems that there might be certain relevant cases where no one is responsible, and that's somehow problematic. So, and this paper is going to be concerned with this debate, but it's actually not going to take a stance within the debate, but it's going to take a different kind of approach to the question. So, and the paper has basically two main goals. So one of the goals is not very ambitious, and I think a lot of people already are recognizing this, but it still kind of shapes the debate. So the first goal is just to make explicit that the debate shouldn't be concerned just with self-driving cars or autonomous weapon systems, and instead we should recognize that if there is a problem here, it's a problem for basically all software applications or robots that engage in some sort of autonomous decision-making. The second, a more interesting goal of the paper is that we want to argue that the responsibility gap problem can and actually should be approached as a conceptual engineering problem. And we're going to, at the end, I'm going to try to sketch one way how you could conduct the discussion if you see the responsibility gap problem in this way. And basically our hypothesis is that this debate about the responsibility gap problem is at a stage where the best way or one very fruitful way of making progress lies in systematically investigating what concept of responsibility we ought to use. So here's the outline for the talk. First, I'm going to briefly explain how we view the responsibility gap problem. Then I'm going to present our argument for the hypothesis that the debate basically is at a point of what we call conceptual stalemate, or is reaching such a point. And then we're going to suggest conceptual engineering as a way out of this conceptual stalemate, and then end the talk with how you might engineer responsible AI through conceptual engineering. All right, so let's go to the first point. So what's the responsibility gap problem? So the problem arises, let me rephrase it differently. So people have started to recognize that there is this problem with the advent of a new sort of technology. Specifically, with machine learning and the wealth of available data that we now have, it's becoming, well, possible to build increasingly sophisticated systems that are able to execute a number of ever increasingly complex tasks. I mean, obviously, there are certain kinds of things that they cannot and might never be able to do, but there's more and more things that these systems are able to do. And it's plausible to say of some such systems, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, and that they are agents, at least in the minimal sense that they can engage in decision making and that they can act in accordance with the decisions that they make. So these systems can basically gather information and process it. They can evaluate that information in the light of the goals that people set for them. And then they can, using the information and the goals, they can basically make decisions and execute them. We can expect that there will be systems like this that take over more and more tasks, right? And that they are able to do a relatively broad range of things. And importantly, they will be able to do these tasks autonomously, at least, and this is the only sense that we're going to consider here, at least in the weakest sense that they can do this independently of human interference, right? So no human has to interfere for these systems. So for example, just to use the example of a self-driving car, so self-driving car at some point will be able to just drive to the destination that you set to it without anyone having to interfere in its decision making and so on. Now, just for the sake of convenience, we're going to call these systems AI. Obviously, that's a stipulative definition, right? So obviously, other people might mean other things by AI. We are going to use the term AI for these sorts of systems. So how do these systems relate to the responsibility gap problem? So the problem roughly arises like this. So suppose you have an AI, could like a self-driving car or an autonomous weapon system or an autonomous trader, right? Financial trader or a healthcare bot or something. And the AI makes a decision that causes a harm. And now assume further that this is a special case where neither the failure that resulted in the harm nor the harm could have been foreseen by those who used and designed the AI. And the harm was also not intended, right? So like an autonomous weapon system will cause harm, but often the harm is intended by the people who built the system. I mean, that's what it's for. But just assume that the harm is not one that was intended. So the question that arises, of course, is in that case, well, who's responsible for this harm? And basically the responsibility gap problem arises, or I mean, the argument that there is a problem here is pushed by looking at all the possible candidates for responsibility. So first we look at, could the AI be the responsible agent? And then it's plausible to say, at least for what we might mean by AI, that the answer is no, right? So these kinds of AI just lack at least some required capacity for moral responsibility. And you can, of course, have a dispute about what that would be, but I mean, I think it's very plausible that that's the case. But of course, then, and this is how the argument goes on, the problem is that these AI have an autonomous agency, and this agency interferes with some sort of necessary condition for attributing moral responsibility. So there are arguments that focus on the epistemic condition, for example. But so in this talk, in the paper, we should only focus on the control condition. Obviously, you can have you could do the same sort of argument. We are focusing on the epistemic condition or some other condition, but just for the sake of presentation, we're focusing on that problem. Okay, so long story short, so if it's the case that neither the AI nor any human is responsible for the harm, then it seems like there's no one who's going to be responsible for this harm. And that means that there would be a responsibility gap. And that's the responsibility gap problem. I mean, in one sense, that's not fully yet the problem, because you can ask yourself, why is that even a problem, right? That there is no one who's responsible. And I've actually grappled with this question a lot, but I'm just going to set it aside here. Or I'm going to say a little bit about that in a second, but I'm not sure whether I'm fully happy with the answers we give, but let's just move on for a second. So one thing to note about the way we've presented the argument here is that if there is an issue here, it's a completely general issue, right? So from the presentation of the responsibility gap itself, it basically already that supports the first claim that we're trying to make, which is that when we look at the problem, we should focus on all software applications, not just on autonomous driving systems or self-driving cars, because there are many different kinds of things that AI could be involved in, and where it could engage in autonomous decision making, and there's just nothing that really singles out AWS or self-driving cars as particularly relevant for the responsibility gap. I mean, I didn't even talk, I mean, the argument itself, as I presented it, didn't even refer to any of these potential AI applications. And because the only thing that's really relevant is that the task that we're focusing on could potentially have harmful outcomes, right? And then when we have an AI that engages in autonomous decision-making that could potentially result in harmful outcomes, then the responsibility gap problem can arise. And it's plausible that many or even all tasks that could be taken over by AI falls into this category. I mean, I think it's very plausible that it's many. Whether it's all, I think is a question open to debate. I was thinking like AlphaGo, for example, wouldn't fall into this category, but Johannes thinks that even the AlphaGo falls into this category. So I guess there we have a slight disagreement, but I don't think it really matters, because I think it's relatively clear that if there is a problem here, it's a general problem. It's not just a problem that arises for particular sorts of AI applications. So let's just briefly focus on the question, why is this a problem, right? So why are responsibility gaps a problem? And as I already said, I've myself been a little bit puzzled by this issue. So I've tried to figure this out a little bit, and this is also going to be relevant later on. So I think in a sense, I think responsibility gaps are a problem because they can give rise to certain kinds of moral problems. And these problems will often arise when there are responsibility gaps. So I think the first and most obvious problem is that, and I think this is what, so for example, Andreas Matthias, for example, when he talks about the responsibility gap, I think this is kind of why he thinks responsibility gaps are problematic. So I think one problem with responsibility gap is that they just kind of clash with our sense of justice. So just intuitively, it seems like when there is a harm that's caused by an AI, we feel like there should be someone who can be properly held to account, right? So there's a mismatch between there being someone who should be and being no one who can be held to account. And I think this is actually quite plausible, especially if we consider the fact that, so I mean, intuitively, harm that results from AI actions isn't really all that different from when harm occurs due to other technological failures, right? It's not like these kinds of cases do not seem very similar to acts of God or paradigmatic instances of mere accidents. And I think this is kind of the reason why we feel like there's something deeply unjust if there's no one who can be held responsible for these kinds of harms. And of course, I personally think that itself is a problem. But of course, also if these sorts of cases do conflict with our widely held sense of justice, then of course that can also lead to the technology losing legitimacy in the eyes of people, right? So another problem, a more specific one, is that responsibility gaps can also lead to undermine accountability in public institutions. So this doesn't apply to all applications, but all AI applications, but to some. Here basically the problem is that in public institutions, it seems like there's an important democratic requirement that people who make the decisions can be held responsible for the things that happen. But given that we can expect AI to be used increasingly in public and administrative decision making, so one problem that comes up with responsibility gaps is that this requirement might be increasingly violated or eroded. And of course, there's also the danger of exploitation, right? So politicians can actually try to use the fact that there are responsibility gaps to kind of obscure the fact, for example, that they are responsible for something. So there's also kind of misuse, risk of misuse. And then, of course, there are kind of at least two more consequentialist issues, which is, so first, given that responsibility gaps might strongly conflict with our sense of justice, and given that they might, for example, erode things like public accountability, and I mean, maybe in the military, we also need something like this, right? Given these problems, that we might have more reason to just ban the use of the technology or severely restrict its use, right? So, for example, this is what Robert Sparrow argues for autonomous weapon systems. So he thinks that responsibility gaps basically give us a reason to ban autonomous weapon systems. But of course, the problem is that using AI will be hugely beneficial, right? I mean, autonomous weapon systems are a great example for this. So we can expect that if there are ever reliable autonomous weapon systems, that they will probably significantly reduce the amount of harm that will result in war. Maybe not, I don't know. Maybe a less controversial example are self-driving cars, right? So the use of self-driving cars will probably reduce the amount of traffic accidents and so on. And so banning this sort of technology comes at a moral cost, because we have to deprive us of benefits that we would otherwise be able to enjoy. And this is also related to this first moral cost. Another problem with responsibility gaps is that they can undermine the trust that people have in the technology, right? So responsibility gaps could lead to widespread mistrust, and then this will, as a consequence, have negative consequences on innovation or profit proliferation with regards to the technology. So people might be less inclined to buy self-driving cars if there are things like responsibility gaps, and that of course also is a moral cost, right? Because it deprives us of the benefits. So I think this is relatively uncontroversial. I think the best thing would be if there was a world in which we can use AI, but there's no responsibility gaps, right? So we can use it, but there's always someone who's responsible for the harm that they cause. And this, of course, leads us directly to the debate about responsibility gaps, because people have discussed the question whether AI actually do create responsibility gaps or not. And this is what we now focus on. So this is the debate we now focus on. And as I said at the beginning, we're not actually going to intervene in this debate. Instead, we're going to try to argue for the thesis that this debate is reaching the point of conceptual stalemate. So what's a conceptual stalemate? So here we draw on David Sharmas's work on verbal disputes. So according to our definition, a dispute about a question reaches conceptual stalemate if it satisfies two conditions. First, the question has been answered in different ways, such that these answers involve different assumptions about the underlying concepts, and the dispute over the question is grounded, at least to a significant extent, in disagreements over the content of one or more underlying concepts. So conceptual stalemates aren't really, I don't think that they're really a rare phenomenon. They're probably quite widespread, at least in philosophy. And that's unsurprising because, in a sense, philosophy, a huge part of what philosophy does is just to try to clarify the content of the core concepts in a debate that the people are concerned with, right? So if you look, so consider, for example, the debate whether free will is compatible with determinism, right? So one of the first things that people do is to try to clarify what they mean by free will and determinism. And a huge part of the debate is just concerned with trying to clarify these concepts, especially the concept of free will. Now, what happens when people engage in this sort of philosophical work, of course, is that they basically uncover conceptual possibilities, right? So, for example, again, if you use the example of the free will debate, so compatibilists, for example, they make a suggestion about the concept of free will that is such that free will would be compatible with determinism, and then incompatibilists make their own suggestions about what the content of free will is. Maybe, for example, it requires some sort of absolute or ultimate control or something along those lines. And what the people are doing then when they're trying to clarify the content of these concepts is actually they discover different possible ways how you could understand the core concepts, right, in the debate. So they're covering conceptual possibilities. Now, at some point, what's going to happen is the conceptual choice points are going to become relatively clear, right? So, I mean, further classification is always going to be possible, of course, and more work can probably always be done. And maybe there are some conceptual possibilities that you haven't uncovered and so on. But I mean, if enough people work on these issues, as it is the case, for example, in a free will debate, then it will become relatively clear what kinds of things what kinds of choice points you have, right? So do you think free will is this, or do you think free will is this? And if you say it is this, and so on. And then what can emerge is a situation where it is actually possible to answer the question in the positive or in the negative, right? If you understand the concepts in a certain kind of way, right? So, for example, if you take Mill's view about free will, right? You can you understand the concepts in the way that Mill understands them. You can say, yes, free will is compatible with determinism, right? If we accept this unpacking of the concept. Now, and if we are in such a situation, but we see that the dispute persists, then that is likely due to disagreement about these concepts, right? And what we have then is basically a conceptual stalemate. So we have a disagreement where it's relatively clear what, you can answer the way in different kinds of ways if you understand the concepts in different sorts of ways, and there's a disagreement about how the concepts are to be understood. Now, conceptual stalemates even aren't actually, or I mean, that's our view. Our view is that conceptual stalemates aren't actually bad, right? They're actually, because they're good in the sense that they can lead to philosophical progress, because once you've uncovered the conceptual possibilities, now you can look at the question, which of these choices is the correct one? And we're going to talk about in the third part of the paper, I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, right? What the correct conceptual choices are. But first, now let me try to make plausible our suggestion that the responsibility gap discussion is actually also reaching the point of conceptual stalemate. Not in the sense, of course, that all the conceptual possibilities have been mapped to the most precise detail that it could be mapped onto, or and so on, but instead that you can answer the question. So it's relatively clear what kind of choice points there are, and you can answer the question in a negative or in a positive, depending on what view you take on the concepts. And the disagreement between the positions is likely going to consist in disagreement about how you should understand these respective concepts. So we think it's plausible that basically whether or not there are responsibility gaps depends on the content of the certain kinds of concepts that are relevant in this discussion. In particular, because we're focusing on the control condition, on the content of the concept of responsibility and of control. And in the debate, actually, different participants to the debate have put forward different sorts of contents for these concepts. So first, and so regarding the cultural conditions, the one that we're focusing on, there are a couple of important choice points that you might face when you're considering how to understand the concept of responsibility. So the first most important choice point is obviously whether you think that responsibility, in the sense that is at stake here, requires control at all, right? So some people, most people, I think, in the debate about responsibility gaps think that it does. But there are some exceptions even to this. So one exception might be Hellstrom, one way to understand him is that he thinks what is required is not control, but autonomous power. And the degree of autonomous power that you have determines whether or not you're responsible. And he uses this idea to try to argue that actually the previous assumption that we made, that the AI itself wouldn't be responsible, to argue that the AI could be responsible. And then in a recent paper, Tigert has argued that we shouldn't just focus on responsibility in the sense of accountability, but also on other forms of responsibility practices like answerability and attributability. But what's noteworthy, of course, is, and this is something that is also comes up in the actual free will debate or responsibility debate, is that these other forms of responsibility, especially attributability, for example, do not require control to the same degree as accountability. And so if responsibility in the relevant sense here isn't really accountability, but some other sense, for example, then maybe you can deny the control condition as well. And importantly, of course, given that the problem that gave rise to the responsibility gap was that the autonomous agency of the AI somehow intervenes with the control condition, if you deny that responsibility requires control, then it's very likely that you can just avoid the responsibility gap problem. Now, this brings us to our second conceptual choice point. Now, if you concede that responsibility requires control, then the next question is, of course, what kind of control does it require, right? And here also different suggestions have been made. And the central issue here, I think, is how control that you think is required for responsibility interacts with the agency of the AI, specifically whether the agency of the AI can be seen as intervening agency such that it undermines the responsibility of any other agents, right? So paradigmatic examples of intervening agency is, of course, human agency. So for example, when there's some other person's actions that stands between me and an outcome, it's often very plausible that their agency intervenes, making it such that I'm no longer responsible or less responsible for what's happening. And so the question is here, of course, whether the sort of control that is required for responsibility is interfered with by the agency of the AI. And basically, everyone who thinks that there is a responsibility gap problem basically relies on an understanding of control on which that kind of agency that the AI possesses is intervening agency, right? So Matthias says, for example, nobody has enough control over the machine's actions to be able to assume responsibility for them, right? Sparrow says, military personnel will be held responsible for the actions of machines whose decisions they did not control. So these authors all rely on an understanding of control as required by responsibility. That where basically the kind of AI agency the AI possesses will interfere with the control that the human operator has. And of course, it's very likely that if you understand control in this way, that you will have responsibility gaps. But there are at least two ways how you could avoid responsibility gaps. So first, you could concede that agency intervenes or interferes with control, but take a particular stance on the content of agency, right? Where you say that an agent is just an entity that can be held responsible. And if you take this kind of approach, then you also don't get a responsibility gap, because now you basically say, well, if the AI is an agent, then sure, that interferes with control by the humans, but there's no responsibility gap because now the AI is responsible. While if the AI does not qualify for agency, then you don't have a problem because there's nothing that intervenes with the relevant sort of control that the human has. Another thing that you could do is you could take a view about control. And on which basically the agency of others does not interfere with the control that is required for responsibility. And there are many ways how you could do this. So here are just two possibilities. So you might think that we have control over probabilistic outcomes, right? And that the control we have over responsibility over probabilistic outcomes or risk impositions is sufficient for responsibility. Or you could say, you could use a weaker notion, even weaker notion of control, where you say there's such a thing as supervision, which is a relevant sort of control, but different from the sort of control that Matthias and Sparrow, for example, presuppose. And then in all of these cases, you get the result that there is no responsibility gap, because we do have these weaker forms of control over the actions of the AI. Now, as I said, it's not our aim to argue for any of these views here. Instead, the point is only this. It seems very plausible if we look at this debate that whether or not there is a responsibility gap depends on conceptual issues. It depends on questions about, like, does responsibility require control? What kind of control does it require? What sort of agency does AI possess? And all of these questions depend on how we understand the concepts and question. Now, what the literature already has done, and it's doing this, is still doing this, right? So this is an ongoing debate, has explored already to some degree the relevant conceptual alternatives, and the questions have been answered one way or the other, right? So some people say, yes, there are responsibility gaps. And some people say, no, there are no responsibility gaps, but it always depends on the kind of concepts that they're presupposing. So, and plausibly, if this disagreement persists, and we can assume that the disagreement is partially grounded in disagreements about the concepts. And so that's support for our first thesis, that this dispute is basically approaching a conceptual stalemate. And that raises, of course, the question, what should we do now, right? So what should we do when our debate has reached this point? I mean, one thing that we should do, obviously, is we should just go on and further investigate conceptual choice points. But another thing that we should do now is we should focus on the question which conceptual choices regarding responsibility would be correct. And that of course raises yet another question, which is, what do we mean when we say that conceptual choices are correct? And there are basically two sorts of answers that you can give. So one is, I think, so one answer is just you say what we must do is we must figure out what our actual concepts are, right? So we need to figure out, what do we mean when we say that someone is responsible? Or when we think someone is responsible, what is the concept that we're using when we're thinking this? And I think in some sense, this is probably what the debate is charitably construed is about. Now, I think that there's at least two problems with this sort of first answer, which are reasons why we shouldn't take that first answer. The first problem is just that I personally, and I think there's very good evidence to think that this is the case, I think it's very plausible that it's not very plausible that the question what our actual concept of responsibility is can be resolved to a satisfactory extent. And this is not, I think the reason for this is just that the actual concepts that we use, or the words that we use, right? They have many different aspects that pull us in very many different directions, and it's very, very likely that whatever analysis you impose is going to strain against some relevant aspect of the concept, such that there's going to be no analysis that's going to be fully satisfactory of the actual concepts. There's always going to be something missing. And that's because the content of our action concept is probably vague or indeterminate to some extent. Secondly, and more relevantly though, I think that it's just doubtful that pointing to our actual concept is going to have the right sort of normative significance to resolve the dispute that we're engaged with, right? So suppose that it turns out our actual concept of responsibility is such that there are responsibility gaps, right? I think we can legitimately then say, so what? Why does that matter? Given that there are other concepts that we have discovered other possible concepts that don't raise responsibility gaps, why shouldn't we go for one of these, right? And just saying, but that's what we mean by responsibility, I think is not going to be a satisfactory answer. So that brings us to our second way of understanding this claim that we should figure out what conceptual choices are correct, which is that we should figure out what concepts we ought to use, right? So we should engage in conceptual engineering, where conceptual engineering is just, as we understand it, is a methodological approach that's concerned with concepts and the words we use to express them, and which urges us not to just consider what concepts we actually use, but also which concepts we could use and which ones we ought to use, right? So what it does is it aims to evaluate and improve our conceptual repertoire. And the basic idea, that lies behind our acceptance of conceptual engineering in this context is just this idea that, well, words and concepts are things that do things for us, right? They're useful things, and we have interests that are at stake when we use them. And these interests can, of course, be representational interests, right? So sometimes when we use a word, we're interested in picking something out in the world, right? And we're interested in picking out maybe a theoretically interesting kind, but sometimes the interests that we have are also practical, right? So maybe we use a word to justify what we're doing, or maybe we're using a word to insult someone, right? And these are also interesting and relevant interests that we have in using the concept. And given that we have these interests, what we should do is we should ask normative questions, specifically two relevant normative questions here. First, which of these interests are the most important ones, right? So what's the thing that the concept should do for us, and what concept should we do should we use given these are our most important interests? All right, so I think it should be relatively clear. So what's attractive? One thing that's attractive, of course, about conceptual engineering is that it just avoids the problems that the alternative one had, right? So, and that I think makes it just a better answer or better approach in response to the request for the correct choice of concepts. But that, of course, also means that given that the correct choice of concept is determined by conceptual engineering, if the responsibility gap debate is reaching conceptual stalemate, we should also see the responsibility gap problem as a conceptual engineering problem. So what we should focus on is what should the content of the underlying concepts be? Now, this suggestion, of course, raises a lot of questions, methodological questions and so on, and obviously these are all fair questions. I'm not going to talk about these questions, especially because I'm basically out of time now, but also because that's not what we're doing in the paper. Instead, I just want to end the paper by very, very briefly sketching one way how you could make progress on the responsibility gap problem using conceptual engineering. So just to start, I'm going to introduce this notion of a responsibility concept, which is basically any concept that can feasibly regulate the set of emotional and practical responses and practices that we associate with moral responsibility. And I think basically what conceptual engineering for responsibility will be concerned with is which responsibility concept should regulate our responsibility-related practices. And to determine that, we need to figure out what interests we have, what interests are at stake when we're using responsibility concepts. And if we want to use conceptual engineering to address the responsibility gap problem, what we need to argue is that our most important interests favor conceptual choices that close responsibility gaps. Now, I think one thing that already speaks in favor of any concept that does so, of course, are the kinds of practical issues that we highlighted earlier, right? So the kinds of problems that you face when there are responsibility gaps, these kinds of problems already give us good reason to favor responsibility concepts that don't give rise to responsibility gaps. But of course, we still need to figure out whether there are other interests that pull in different directions and how strongly they do so. And that raises the question, what are the important functions that responsibility concepts might play? And we now have a list, like we have 6 possible functions that responsibility concepts could play. I'm just going to briefly mention them and then go on to how you would have to argue based on this. Okay, so first, most importantly for our discussion is the ledger function of responsibility concepts, which is responsibility concepts can be used to facilitate a form of moral accounting, right? So they allow us to keep books on what can be attributed to whom. And here, basically, the ledger is a metaphor, and it's a metaphor and overall assessment of a person's conduct. If you take the ledger function seriously, then, so on a ledger function, the responsibility concept will attributing responsibility presupposes wrongdoing. And so it will be part of the responsibility concept that will be concepts of right and wrong. Now, that's one function that responsibility concepts can play, but there are many other functions as well. So there's, for example, justificatory answerability functions. So basically allowing us to figure out who has to answer for what happened or who has to offer justification for what happened. There might be retributive functions, right? So we just use responsibility to pick out someone who has to be punished for what happens, right? There are communicative educational functions. So we use responsibility concepts to express and communicate moral norms in our community. There's incentive functions where we use responsibility concepts to basically impose incentive structures, giving people reasons to act in certain sorts of ways. And there are compensatory functions. So making sure that those who have suffered damages are adequately compensated. Now, the reason why I rushed through these, I rushed through these to save time, but also because the point that I want to end the discussion with is can be made with just this sketch, because it seems very plausible that you get responsibility gaps that are most closely fit the ledger role, right? So the ledger role presupposes that people are responsible only if they did something wrong, and that of course requires the right kind of causal connection between their action and the kind of thing that we can plausibly say that what they did was wrong. So if responsibility gaps are most likely to arise when we give the ledger role prominence. The other kinds of concepts don't give rise to responsibility gaps as easily, and there are actually some of these that would specifically favor concepts that would avoid responsibility gaps, right? So, for example, the compensatory function or the retributive function, right? So making always sure that bad deeds don't go unpunished. Basically, any concept that fits that role is going to not allow for responsibility gaps. So what we have to do is, if we want to engineer away the responsibility gap problem, we have to argue that the cost is bearable when we accept a responsibility concept that discards the ledger function or restricts its relevance. So that's the way, we think is the way forward if we want to engineer ourselves out of the responsibility gap problem. Now that suggestion seems quite plausible, actually, and it looks plausible because if you just look at the debate about responsibility gaps, there are lots of suggestions for concepts that would allow us to avoid responsibility gaps, but which do seem to serve the kinds of practical interests that we have in our responsibility responsibility practice. And so prima facie, at least, it's quite plausible. But more work needs to be done that I cannot do here. So I guess I think I'm 5 minutes over, which I apologize for. But I'll just end the discussion here, and I'm going to stop my screen sharing now.
Great. So thanks, Sebastian. Thanks very much. I thought it was a super interesting, very good talk and presentation. Yeah, many things to think about. So, but are there any questions? Just raise a hand or a Q in the chat.
I mean, if it's just clarificatory questions, that's fine as well.
Yeah. So you can also think about the question I can ask. Oh, Luciano, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks, Sebastian. It was really interesting. I really enjoy. So this very nuanced discussion on what it meant by responsibility is very good. And so during your talk, I think you make some connections. Sort of like autonomous weapon system, automated vehicle. They have some kind of agency called an AI. They cause harm, responsibility gaps, and then go justice and all the harms caused by lack of justice. So, but you focus on the conceptual engineering for the responsibility gap, which is on the middle of this part. But I was thinking, if you make the connection through automated vehicle, weapon systems to AI, you use the concept of agency, for example.
Yeah.
And wouldn't that also require some conceptual engineering? So where do we stop? Because you need to have some assumptions to get to the responsibility gap.
Yeah. I mean, so I think so. I mean, first of all, thanks for the question. I think that's a good question. I mean, I think one question. So where do we stop? I mean, at some point, I think we should stop. When we're doing conceptual engineering, we probably have to stop at like basic normative stuff. At least when we're focusing on specific normative questions, right? Obviously, we can also engineer our normative concepts, but then we get to never-ending engineering. But obviously, yes, I agree that we need to also think about the concept of agency that's at play here, and how it connects to control. I mean, I think, so I tried to highlight that in the middle part as well. So Robillard, for example. So some people, I mean, at the beginning, the concept of agency I used at the beginning is like a very minimal sense of agency, where you're an agent basically when you are involved in decision making of a certain side of sort. But of course, you could just say that's not really agency. That's not really the relevant kind of agency that it matters for control. And that's in a sense also an engineering question. So yes. Where do I think it stops? I mean, in a sense, it stops. So when you look, I think when you look at a specific debate, what you should look at are the central concepts that the debate is concerned with, and then consider those. But of course, you are right that it gets expansive very, very far. I mean, one thing that I did, for example, that I didn't talk about so much is of course that what we say about this debate has implications for other things as well, right? So,
concept of fairness, justice, of harm, and then you can go all the way there, right? Yeah. But nice, thank you.
Good. So maybe to follow up on that. So you said maybe our conceptual engineering in those cases does have some consequences in other contexts. So maybe we find out that responsibility means in this context means something, and if I understood you correctly, you think that this automatically maybe means that it also means the same conception of responsibility is also applicable in another context. Or so is that what you? Because that I would be very skeptical about that claim. But is that what you want? Is that one of the things that we this discussion teaches us? So how to use responsibility in other contexts, or do you allow for some kind of conceptual pluralism? Maybe that maybe different conceptions of contexts might be appropriate in conceptions of concepts might be appropriate in different contexts. Or yeah.
No, I think that's a great question. I have always assumed that we just want the same concept for all contexts. But now that now your question basically, I don't see why that should be the case. I think. So, what we do want is, so we want a concept that regulates our responsibility. We want concepts that regulate our responsibility practice, right? So our blaming and praising and criticizing practices. So, but I think it's quite plausible, actually, that for different sorts of assessments, we need different sorts of responsibility concepts. As long as it's relatively clear that what concept we're using for what contexts. But I do think that, in a sense, so, okay. I do agree with you that we probably should be pluralist to some extent. But given that it's very, what we have here is responsibility when we're using a technological application, right? And it seems like very plausible that the standards that apply in that case also should apply to other cases. So yeah.
Yeah. Good.
Is that helpful or?
Yeah, that is helpful. So it might be, of course, be interesting. So what then determines? So there must be some overlap between different contexts. If there's good reason to assume that conception in one context is also appropriate in the other. So then, and that probably needs more work. So yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, as usual. It's already 2 minutes after the time that we should end.
I thought because we started 5 minutes late.
That's right. So if you have time, if there are people who want to ask a question, I'm more than happy to.
I'm just sitting in my home, so.
Herman, you have a comment from Diana in the chat.
Oh, good. Oh, thanks. Oh, thank you, Luciana. So, Diana, do you want to ask a question, or shall I just read it out loud?
I can't see the chat. So.
Oh, okay. So I just read it out loud. So we may need to better or more thoroughly engineer the concept of conceptual engineering itself, so that we don't end up in an infinite recursive engineering loop. Somewhat ironically.
Yeah.
Good. I think Chalmers made some similar remarks. Yeah.
Yeah.
You agree?
Yeah. There is a problem. Yeah. So we do. I think this is the worst thing, of course, is. As a meta-ethicist, I've already heard about this a lot, because the normative concepts, using the normative concepts, right? That is going to raise some really, really tricky issues. But I think if we can resolve that, everything else is kind of going to be fine.
That's a big if, though. Sorry to just barge in.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is a big if. So.
Yeah, so then that's to the meta-ethics first.
Yeah, meta-ethics first, obviously. And I actually was at a workshop where Matti was there, right? Matti Eklund. And someone was making an argument that actually, I think, just to bring in a little bit of meta-ethics at the end, someone was making an argument that actually, but probably expressivism has to be true about the most fundamental arts. So that's why I'm fine with.
Yeah, that's where you're happy with this. Good, I understand. Good. So I think we've already moved too much from our original topic. So let's just end. And thanks, Sebastian. I really like this talk.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. And thanks for the questions. So, yeah, and I mean, apologies that